battle for the mind will be fought in the video arena.
Render your television sets inoperable.
Why do you watch these films?
I've seen enough horror movies to know any weirdo wearing a mask is never
Whatever
friendly.
appears on the television screen emerges as raw experience.
Ultimate experience in interactive terror.
Monster movies are education.
Television is reality.
The video word made flesh.
And reality is less than television.
Won't quote me. You won't mention my name on the TV.
Your reality is already half video hallucination. If you're not careful, become total hallucination.
Hello Video Drones, and thanks for tuning into Channel 83. We are the TV guide for weirdos, the video word made flesh, evangelists of the obscure, and this week we are continuing our dive into the horror cinema of East and Southeast Asia with the help of a very special guest. That's right, we are joined yet again by a friend of the cast and host of the Best Little Horror House in Philly podcast, George Heffler. How are you doing this evening, George?
Hello, happy to be here and to talk about fun giant monsters.
Hell yeah. So if you listen to the cast, you should be familiar with George's work, as it was only a few months ago when we had him on to talk about Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. But for the uninitiated, why don't you tell us once more just a little bit about your show and yourself?
Sure. So I am the host of the Best Little Horror House in Philly, like you said. It's a show where we talk about the best horror movie ever made, according to our guest at least. And, it's just a real fun time where whatever movie the guest wants to talk about, I agree that it's the best horror movie ever made for the duration of the episode. And we just have a real nice time talking about movies that we like. And that's kind of how I approach a lot of horror, is I try and see the good in it. And, I don't let it stop me from saying something is bad. But, I try and bring a pretty positive attitude to my movie watching experiences.
Beautiful. So, yeah, I mean, I've been on George's show. He's been on this show, specifically episodes 127 and 82.
Hell yeah.
Go check those out if you
Extra,
haven't.
Baby.
Yes, and I believe you will have some more extra-related content coming from your show in the future, so
that's right.
Be on the lookout for that. And so this time, George actually volunteered to come on the show and talk about tonight's film, which is the 1985 North Korean kaiju epic Pulgasari. And it actually ended up working out pretty well, because not only was I having some trouble trying to decide how I wanted to approach this one, but also you, George, have recently gotten pretty immersed in South Korean genre cinema. So there's some nice synchronicity there. What's it been like to dip your toes into that?
It's been really great. I have really found myself enjoying the hell out of it. And I did mention this to you. I think that a lot of it has to do with the fact that guns are not really as big of a thing in Korean culture. And so in a lot of their action thrillers and stuff, which, to be clear, are usually very grotesque and violent, the choreography is usually really kind of beautiful, because it's a lot more like knives and hatchets and stuff, and a lot more hand-to-hand combat, which just, I think, makes for some really interesting fight scenes and allows the film itself to do some pretty interesting stuff. Plus the fact that it's so new in the scheme of film has really allowed them to build up their influences and kind of hit the ground running in a really interesting way. That I mean, so many people talk about the genre blending of South Korean cinema. I remember when Parasite came out, it was all everyone could talk about. And, Bong Joon-ho is really amazing at it, but he's definitely not the only one who does that. Right. I think that Korean cinema, by and large, does a really interesting job of kind of jumping back and forth between genres. And for someone who's not necessarily used to it, it can cause a little bit of tonal whiplash. But once you really get used to that sort of thing, it just is so interesting to not have to be in one attitude the entire time. Yeah.
Those are all really good, interesting points. I think for me, when I first started kind of getting into the cinema of East and Southeast Asia, I think what you're talking about with the tonal shift, kind of the thing that was the most jarring to me is how much slapstick comedy you can see in a very serious movie.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting the point you made about them not really having a gun culture, because I just watched Memories of Murder on your recommendation this weekend, and I feel like all the times when there normally would have been a cop pistol whipping someone in that movie, they instead just did like a jump kick to the chest.
Yeah, but you can't tell me that that's way more fun.
Yeah, and way more effective, honestly. So, yeah, I mean, and one of the other ones you talked about and introduced me to, The Man Standing Next, which I just watched last night, may end up having some relevance to tonight's discussion.
Yeah, that was another pretty cool one. It's more of a like political spy thriller than a lot of the more like action focused ones that are sort of more popular in terms of the crossover, things like I Saw the Devil and stuff. But it was pretty cool, and it's the story of the South Korean president who had held on to power through various machinations and basically becoming a dictator after the Korean War and the uprising and the revolution and everything, and their democracy was so undermined by the people who took power that the head of the KCIA basically felt like he had no other choice but to institute a second coup and basically install a new leader. But that also had a lot of long-term ramifications because the person who came in after them wasn't great either. And so it's just really interesting to see a political thriller like that without having sort of the cultural baggage of being immersed in that culture. I mean, look, don't get me wrong. I understand that, of course, the person who made this film is bringing their own bias and everything to it, and I'm only seeing one side of the story here.
Right.
And, you know, the fact that it is a pretty complex issue between, like, am I supposed to root for this military-backed coup or the dictator? Like, it's kind of a rock and a hard place in terms of who you're supposed to root for, but I think that that's kind of what made it so interesting for me.
Definitely, and we will be definitely getting into some of that stuff because I feel like the whole Korean peninsula is sort of a blank spot for a lot of Americans. We kind of just learn in school, oh, there was that war. We came in to rescue the South Koreans and we've been best friends ever since. And South Korea is basically just America Junior, but in Asia. And that's kind of all we are taught about it over here. So yeah, we'll definitely be talking a little bit more about some of that stuff later on. And so when I was sitting down and thinking about how I wanted to approach this film, Pulgasari, I really considered just not talking about any of the story behind the production and not getting into any cultural context, not exploring any deeper analysis or interpretation of the possible themes, because when you are talking about stuff that is this complicated and is this political, I feel like it's so easy to get something wrong and rub people the wrong way. And then, as you were saying, there's the added dimension in this instance of I'm talking about the politics of a culture that I'm not even a part of. And it really gets into a territory where I have a lot of discomfort around expressing my opinions. And frankly, the fear of offending someone has been enough to prevent me from getting into similar topics in the past. And I know you, George, aren't necessarily shy about diving into history and sensitive topics. You've done it on episodes about Shin Gojira, Dr. Strangelove, and most recently, La Llorona. So I kind of just wanted to get your perspective on this. Are these things that you worry about when you're doing an episode like this on your show? Has there ever been anything you weren't willing to talk about? Just sort of your general experience on your show with this type of stuff.
I do struggle with it. I usually wind up just going for it because a lot of the time, well, first of all, a lot of the time we're talking about something that's at least American in context. Right. It's not always the case, like La Llorona. But even then, it's a little more cut and dry in terms of like the La Llorona one is about a genocide. And so I don't necessarily feel as bad being like, I don't think you should have done that, genociders.
Right.
But in terms of stuff like the Dr. Strangelove episode, I do kind of let my politics bleed into the way that I approach stuff because I'm a pretty progressive person and I don't basically when I was like, do I feel comfortable talking about this stuff and possibly offending someone who's maybe a little more conservative? And ultimately, you have to think about the kind of people that you want to surround yourself with. And I was like, I would rather have an audience of like-minded people who are maybe a little bit smaller,
right?
Than have to really censor myself and have to worry about that sort of thing, because, you know, that's the whole beauty of being independent and being a little smaller, is that I can say what I think. And if that can influence people to maybe consider a take that they hadn't previously, you know, I think I'm all for that. The things that really give me a little more pause than necessarily politics is bringing up some of the bad stuff that directors and producers and actors have done. Yeah. Because when we're talking about a movie, it is because the person who came on the show loves that movie. And so when someone who loves Alfred Hitchcock comes on the show, and then all of a sudden I start talking about how terribly he treated the women who starred in his movies, despite the fact that he absolutely made incredible films, he treated the women in them like crap. And that's just a fact. But if you walk up to someone who is generously donating their time to you and you're like, by the way, the guy who made this movie you want to talk about, he's an asshole. Like, it can be hard not to feel like that's an attack on you.
Right.
Because, and so, you know, sometimes I do struggle with that, but I also tend to think that, if they're coming on the show, they probably have some idea of this person's history. And, if I can, I try and communicate the fact that I still can enjoy the movie while not, condoning everything that the person has done. And so, you know, it kind of just becomes, at some point, you have to trust your audience to be able to take what you're saying, as at face value and know that you're trying your best. And, that's kind of it, really.
Yeah. And really, I guess all of this talk thus far has really just been kind of a huge disclaimer. It's sort of my way of pre-apologizing in case either of us just does get something wildly wrong about this film or the context in which it was produced. Hopefully we won't. We both sincerely try our best for that never to be the case, but as the saying goes, nobody's perfect.
Nobody's perfect, even.
Yep. And so here is the part. This episode's going to require quite a bit of background, so there's going to be a lot of me just saying things, and I hope you guys, and George in particular, can just bear with me, because I promise it is relevant and it is going somewhere. This was one of those ones when I was like really digging into it. It was kind of like, when do I start and when do I stop?
Yeah. It can be difficult to be like, how far, because obviously all of human history stacks. It builds on itself. And so in the La Llorona episode, when I'm trying to talk about like the things that led up to the genocide, I'm like, I'm already 80 years back talking about like the United Fruit Company and the U.S. interventionism in Central and South America, like, and how that led to the first Guatemalan Civil War. And like, it can really kind of get away from you, especially when you are nervous about offending someone. You're like, I'm trying to do as much research as possible and really present the context that led me to this train of thought. And you know, covering your own butt can sometimes bite it instead.
Yeah, and that one's kind of similar, because it's kind of like, okay, well, I'm going back 80 years, but do I need to get into like Spanish colonialism in the area? Because that also plays a part. Right. Are we going to go back to the days of Columbus? Like, when do you say enough is enough?
Right.
And so, like I said, we got to talk about not only some of the history of the Korean Peninsula, but then with this one, we also have to talk about the story of how director Shin Sang-ok ended up in North Korea filming a giant monster movie.
Hell yeah, double
And I'm
history.
also going to pre-apologize for both of us getting any of the pronunciations of names wrong. You don't speak Korean, do you,
Nope.
George? Okay, yeah, I don't either. So we apologize for any of that. And so, yeah, it's really hard to give an accurate and fairly balanced distillation of events, but I'm going to try my best. So from 1910 until 1945, Korea had been under Imperial Japanese rule, and so it did not have a legitimate, internationally recognized government once the Japanese occupation ended with the end of World War II. So after the Japanese surrender in 1945, the peninsula was divided in half along the 38th parallel, with the northern half occupied by the Soviet Union and the southern half occupied by the United States. In December of 1945, roughly 2 months after the end of World War II, foreign ministers from the US, UK, and Soviet Union met in Moscow to discuss a variety of topics, which included a plan for what to do about the Korean Peninsula. They decided that Korea would be administered by a US-Soviet joint commission, with the goal of granting Korea its independence within 5 years. But by 1948, it became obvious that this commission wasn't really getting anything done, and 2 separate nations were officially established on the peninsula. The Republic of Korea, which we in the US call South Korea, led by US-backed President Syngman Rhee, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which we in the US call North Korea, led by Soviet-backed Premier Kim Il-sung. The next 2 years saw a number of skirmishes in the south, mostly instigated by communist insurgents, before war officially broke out between the two sides on June 25th, 1950. And, of course, a tale as old as time, the United States and Soviet Union got involved.
What?
And the Korean War became one of the many proxy wars between the US and Soviet Union during the Cold War. And I actually looked this up because I had assumed that this would have been the first proxy war between the US and Soviet Union to start after World War II, but this was actually like the 6th or 7th. So,
yeah.
Fun fact right there. And so then, the Korean War ended in an armistice agreement in 1953, although there never has been an official peace treaty, and the two nations are still separated by a heavily armed border
Joint Security Area.
Yeah, the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, or Joint Security Area.
Another good movie.
Yeah. And both nations were plagued by inner turmoil in the decades that followed. South Korea went through a series of autocratic leaders, military coups, as we were talking about earlier, and oppressive regimes until the late 1990s. And then the North Korean government, although initially Marxist-Leninist in character, became increasingly insular and nationalistic, resulting in the formation of a new state ideology known as Juche and a dynastic succession of power for the male descendants of Kim Il-sung. And the first such descendant, Kim Il-sung's oldest son, Kim Jong-il, is pretty much the key figure in all of this because in 1978, Kim Jong-il allegedly orchestrated the kidnapping of acclaimed South Korean director Shin Sang-ok and Shin's ex-wife, actress Chae Yun-hee, in an effort to advance the North Korean film industry and earn recognition for North Korean cinema at the international level. And so this is kind of where things get complicated and controversial. So if you have heard anything about Pulgasari, you've probably just heard that it was a North Korean monster movie directed by a South Korean filmmaker who was abducted by Kim Jong-il. And that is the prevailing narrative, at least in the US. But it's one of those things that the more you dig into it, really the less cut and dry it becomes. So, George, did you end up doing much digging into this whole story of Shin Sang-ok and Chae Yun-hee's abduction?
No, I wound up getting caught up in Kim Jong-il's On the Art of Cinema instead.
Yeah. So, the common version of this story goes like this. In 1978, Chae Yun-hee was lured to Hong Kong, believing that she would be offered the opportunity to direct a film. There, she was abducted and taken to North Korea. And 6 months later, Shin Sang-ok was also abducted in Hong Kong while searching for Chae. The two were kept separate for 5 years in North Korea, neither of them knowing that the other had been abducted. Chae was kept in a luxury accommodations known as Building Number 1, and she spent her days studying the writings of Kim Il-sung, and at night, Kim Jong-il would take her to various social gatherings and performances, like movies, operas, etc. Shin, on the other hand, was held in a prison camp after 2 unsuccessful escape attempts. Eventually, Shin began to show regrets for having tried to escape, and began writing letters to Kim Jong-il expressing a desire to direct films that would glorify North Korea. Shin was released from prison. And in 1983 with Che, in 1983, he was reunited with Che at a party hosted by Kim Jong-il. That was the first time they had seen each other. That was the first time they were even aware that the other was in North Korea.
Wow, crazy small world. Imagine you guys are both here.
And from then on, they were forced to watch and critique 4 films a day selected from Kim Jong-il's personal collection, which reportedly consisted of over 15,000 films. And yeah, I should also mention that he is a huge cinephile. The book that George was talking about, on the art of the cinema, is like almost 500 pages long.
It's not short, that's for sure. That guy needs an editor, I'll tell you what. It honestly, the book itself is not so insanely terrible. There's a lot of it is pretty self-explanatory, but my God, the guy can ramble.
Yeah, I read not as much of it as you did, and I got the same impression.
I guess when everyone's afraid to tell you no, you probably don't get a lot of cuts.
So after that, Kim, he makes Che and Shin watch and critique films, and eventually he tells them that he wants Shin to direct a film and enter it into an international film festival. And over the next 2 years, Shin and Che produce 6 films, the last of which was Pulgasari, which is reportedly the most expensive North Korean film ever made. But then in 1986, Kim allowed them to travel to Vienna under the guise of securing funding for an upcoming film about Genghis Khan. And while there, Che and Shin escaped to the U.S. Embassy building seeking asylum. I've been talking for a long time, but I promise, folks, we're getting towards the end. How you holding up, George?
Hey, I think it's fascinating.
Great. Yeah, and so that's pretty much the generally accepted story of how all of this went down. And Westerners and Americans in particularly are willing to accept that story at face value. Because anytime a crazy story about North Korean leadership hits the papers, we just kind of eat that shit up without questioning it. No matter how insane it sounds. I remember one a few years ago claiming that North Korea was saying that they had discovered a cave where real live unicorns lived. But that's just one of the many examples of ridiculous reports that really don't hold up to any level of scrutiny that Western news outlets just run with. And Western readers are just all too willing to believe.
Yeah, I think that it's really important to remember that there are culture wars happening, even if there aren't real wars happening. And with stuff like Russia and with China and with North Korea, this is not to say that they don't have issues. There are lots of real human rights violations happening in these places. But there are also a lot of stories that get a foothold here that are pretty clearly bullshit. And, people are so willing to believe it because they're so built up as sort of the enemy in media, in your Red Dawns and stuff like that. And it does sort of make it difficult to react to the real things because when something intense and real does happen, people go, oh, that's just China, or oh, that's just North Korea. And it's like, well, this is something that should be addressed, but you're so preoccupied with thoughts of unicorn caves that I don't know. It frustrates me a little bit.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. And I think also with that sort of thing, it really dehumanizes the people that live there that aren't the government.
Right.
It sort of makes them seem like they are just unnaturally stupid somehow because they are willing to believe in unicorns. And so, once you dehumanize these people, that's when a lot of people feel like it's okay. Anytime there's some saber rattling going on from North Korea, I see a lot of comments on social media, which I know is not the best place to look, but that basically amount to oh, we should just fucking glass North Korea and turn it into a parking lot.
Ugh.
Which is just
disgusting.
Abhorrent and disgusting. And there's another dimension to North Korea in particular because South Korea is such a close ally of the United States.
Right.
And on top of that, Americans are really bad at history and really bad about knowing anything about countries that aren't the United States. And so all of that
Sure, well,
leads-
plus the economical difference as well. The fact that it is, in theory, a communist country, as opposed to capitalistic.
And all of that leads to this thing where if you are American and you say anything other than North Korea is 100% the bad guy all the time and everything they do is pure evil, and South Korea is unquestionably right in all circumstances, well, you're not really likely to get a positive reaction.
We're going down together, Chris.
Yeah, and this specifically was the part of the history that I was most hesitant to talk about because it's contrary to a lot of the preconceived notions that Americans have about North and South Korea. So am I saying that the North Korean government is simply the victim of an American smear campaign and that they don't do anything wrong? Absolutely not. But what I am saying is that the facts in this particular case do raise some questions about whether or not the generally accepted version of this story is how it actually happened.
Right.
There is a whole ass documentary called The Lover and the Despot about the abduction of Shin and Che. If you really want to get into all the nitty gritty details of the case. And even in that film, which is highly sympathetic to Shin and Che and does not ever question whether or not their version of events is true, there are still plenty of things in that doc that cast doubt on their story.
Are they in the documentary? Or it's just
so
about
she
them?
is, but he had passed away by that time. I
Okay.
think he died in 2006, and this documentary I think is maybe from 2016.
Mhm.
So she's in it, but he is not. So yeah, I mean, to give you a brief overview, the first thing you really need to know is that Shin Sang-ok was undoubtedly a man who loved filmmaking. He was the rare type of filmmaker who was not only extremely prolific, he directed like 87 films from 1952 to 1994.
Wow.
But he was also highly respected as a master of the craft. The best like analogous figure I can kind of think of would maybe be like a John Ford. I don't really know.
Right.
So he started his own production company, Shin Films, in 1960. And the second thing you really need to know is that in the decades after the Korean War, the South went through a lot of political turmoil. So the first president of South Korea, Syngman Rhee, was extremely anti-communist, extremely pro-American, and extremely authoritarian.
And America was very pro him as well.
Yes. And he was not at all popular during his first term as president, from 1948 to 1952, and probably would not have been reelected had he not ordered a mass arrest of opposition leaders in 1952. When Rhee was reelected in 1956, he removed presidential term limits so that he could serve as the president of South Korea basically until he died, was the plan. But he was finally forced to resign in 1960 after a popular demonstration known as the April Revolution. Rhee was replaced by the democratically elected Yoon Po-soon, who served as president from August 1960 until May 1961, when he was deposed in a military coup led by Park Chung-hee, who would serve as president of South Korea until his assassination by a member of the Korean Central Intelligence Agency in 1979, which is the events depicted in The Man Standing Next that we were talking about earlier.
Right.
So why is this relevant to Shin Sang-ok? Well, because this entire time that all of this stuff is going on, he was working as a film director. He was an artist under these repressive regimes. And in 1959, he was asked by the government to direct a propaganda film about the life of Syngman Rhee. Shin accepted that offer, and the payment he received for Syngman Rhee and the Independence Movement, which is the title of that film, that payment helped him establish his own production company. And when Park Chung-hee became president, he and Shin ended up developing a very close friendship. Shin voluntarily directed a film meant to propagate Park's agricultural policies in 1963 titled Rice. But Shin became perhaps maybe a bit too comfortable with their relationship, and he would repeatedly push the boundaries of what was acceptable under the increasingly strict censorship guidelines of the Park regime. And in 1975, Shin announced that he intended to make a movie about the kidnapping of Kim Dae-jung by Park's KCIA, and the South Korean government revoked Shin Film's certificate. And with that, Shin was effectively barred from making any films in South Korea, although he did manage to direct one film in 1976 for another Korean production house. And at this point, it really shouldn't be too difficult to connect the dots for an alternative explanation for how Shin Sang-ok ended up in North Korea. It is entirely possible that Shin, who up until this point had averaged directing 3 films a year, and who was no stranger to working within the confines of an authoritarian regime, was maybe approached by DPRK agents with an opportunity to direct films again with much higher budgets than he was working with in South Korea, and that Shin accepted this offer. And even according to a former South Korean intelligence agent that was interviewed in The Lover and the Despot, that was the prevailing theory for a lot of South Korean citizens at the time. Many believed that Shin went to North Korea willingly, and that Che's abduction was orchestrated on Shin's behalf. We'll probably never really know what happened, and there's a lot of supporting evidence for both sides that I just didn't have time to go over, but I do think it's kind of necessary to have some understanding of this stuff when talking about Pulgasari. So you still with us, George?
Yeah, do your own research, man. Look up the facts.
So yeah, like I said, I know that was a lot of stuff, a lot of rambling, but I think it will all be germane to our discussion later if we want to analyze the themes of this film.
That's a great story. What an interesting, piece of history.
Yeah, that's crazy. So let's finally get into what this movie actually is. And George, if you would be so kind as to give my vocal cords a rest and kick us off, how does this movie start?
Sure. So you got, this is actually a period piece, which is pretty cool in and of itself. It takes place in, I think, like the 900s.
Something like that.
Yeah, the Goryeo dynasty. And basically, there's a king who is, he's a king. He's a despot. He's ruling everyone. He's got an iron fist, iron used very deliberately. And, everyone is starving. And it opens up with people working and sort of discovering bandits in their area who are sort of looking to maybe kick off some kind of revolution and overthrow this king.
Mm-hmm.
I like that even like right at the beginning of this, that it's very like, you can kind of see how the philosophy that they're trying to communicate is very explicitly text, like, give me some water. No, not until the older people have had some. Father, take a break. No, not until the work is done. Like, it's, that Juche philosophy that you were talking about, that is the prevailing mode of thought in North Korea, is very explicitly talked about in that book that I was talking about, the Art of Cinema.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, Kim Jong-il, his whole thing is that film needs to communicate a story, or it needs to communicate an ideal in order to have merit. And the idea of this sort of the way that they have sort of become so nationalistic and less socialistic was a very sort of gradual movement. When this movie came out in the mid 80s, but it wasn't really until the 90s that the nationalism in North Korea started really, really taking off to the extent that we know it today.
Mm-hmm.
And so at the beginning of this movie, it is very socialistic. It's very, everyone is working and trying to get the crops together, and it's very like worker class oriented. People who feel that they're being oppressed are taking to the forest in order to create this revolution. You can kind of see why Kim Jong-il would be producing this film in order to communicate these ideas of Juche.
Yeah, totally. And it really does seem like you said, even from the beginning and throughout the rest of the film, it really does just seem like a vehicle to communicate a theme, because I think I think some of the characters have names. Probably, I can't really tell you what any of their names are. They're really just sort of like archetypes that serve
a lot of
the
father,
function.
Cousin, uncle, that sort of thing.
Local blacksmith, rebel guerrilla leader hiding out in the mountains.
Right.
So yeah, at a certain point, this president decides that he needs to confiscate all of the iron in this small village in which the story takes place. So he sends in his jackbooted thugs, and he doesn't just take iron of like the weapons of the villagers, but he also takes like pots that they use for cooking, tools they would use to till the soil and whatnot. So he pretty much has sentenced them to death by taking all of their iron just so that he can, I guess, build armor and weapons for his military.
Well, I think he also doesn't want them outfitting the rebels.
Right. I think that, yeah, that's a component to it as well. So,
because the blacksmith, he wanted his daughter to like marry the head rebel.
Right.
And,
yeah, that's
and
right.
so there's that kind of like romance plot line happening as well.
Yeah. So there's like this one rebel guy that is, leading a resistance in the mountains. I think, you know, they know he's in the area. They don't know exactly where he is. And they I don't think they're certain that the blacksmith is outfitting him or giving him tools. He just kind of outs himself to the soldiers by leading a raid against them as they...
Well, they also find a pile of weapons there that the guy was holding on to.
Right.
Where he was like, my friend asked me to hold on to these weapons. And then the blacksmith was like, it's yours, I know it. And he's like, okay, you were right. And they just like hide it under a bunch of hay. And then the soldiers come through and they're like, what are all these weapons under the hay? And that's when things take a turn.
Yeah, so they imprison the blacksmith and the leader of the rebels, as well as, I guess, his confidants and officers. They starve them, right?
Just the blacksmith.
Just the blacksmith for whatever reason, even though, I mean, he really had like the least direct involvement in the whole thing. He's like a 90-year-old man.
Yeah.
So he's starving, and his daughter throws him a rice ball from a distance into the holding cell that he's in. And he uses this rice ball to make a little statue of a little mythical creature called Pulgasari.
What a cutie.
And that statue comes to life, I guess, with the spirit of the proletariat blacksmith imbued in it, and starts eating iron and growing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few scenes of him being cute and tiny.
Holy boy, are there.
Yeah, I really like it. But you know, he starts eating and growing, and they start figuring it out, and you know, they realize that much like the growing rebellious sentiment, that so too do they have a weapon against this oppressive regime.
Ah, yes. So I think the government officials become aware of the existence of Pulgasari. He's like, I don't know, toddler sized or maybe like 6-year-old sized or something. They're going to execute the blacksmith, but Pulgasari intercepts the executioner's axe with his mouth.
Not the blacksmith, the rebel leader.
Ah, that's who it was. Yeah, he intercepts the executioner's axe with his mouth, takes a bite out of it. They start chasing him around. There's some cheesy synth music and whatnot, slapstick comedy.
I loved the score in this. The like electro synth that's happening is so bizarre.
It's so weird.
I thought it was so funny. It's really weird. It's very out of place in a movie taking place between 900 and 1300 BC, or not BC, but 900 and 1300. To have this like electro synth score is very fun.
Yeah, I'm wondering, it's been a while since I've seen some of the later Godzilla movies in the Showa era, or even the 84 Godzilla. So I'm wondering if they were, like, I can't think if there's synth music in those, and maybe they were copying that feel. Yeah. I don't really know where they got it from.
I don't know. That's all them, baby.
So yeah, I mean, what happens from here? Pulgasari he's out and about.
Doing his thing. I guess at a certain point, the villagers realize, like, hey, we can't really fight the government
the king and his army with our weapons, but what we can do is feed the weapons to Pulgasari, because as we feed him, he gets bigger, like you said, and Pulgasari can defend us. Pulgasari can storm the capital and get those fucking assholes that are keeping us in shackles.
And eat those shackles.
Right.
It's like you said, it's very clear that this is sort of a vehicle for the message of it. I will say, I think that it is fun. I think that they are, as much as it is very much a vehicle, you could say that about 1,000 American movies as well.
Oh, yeah.
And,
I mean, original Godzilla is very transparent that it's a vehicle for a message as well. And that's a great classic movie.
Exactly. And so it can still be this very clear message where it's like, oh, it's this unending hunger for the iron and for justice. And like, it's very clear what's happening, but I think that they're also doing it extremely effectively. I like getting to see him sort of grow and how it builds. And again, it does sort of tie in. Look, not to be like Kim Jong-il was really onto something, but
wasn't he though?
But wasn't he though? Because in the book, he talks about how it's important to see, like, a revolutionary is not just born in one moment, that a revolutionary has to see the struggle and embody the struggle, and that it takes place over years and years and years, and that, basically the whole idea is to develop revolutionary consciousness is what he's saying. And this movie is trying to shape ideas through that lens. And I think that, I think it's doing a pretty good job.
Yeah. And one of the reason it's kind of so hard to talk about this movie in specific of like plot points and things like that is that even though it's like 90 minutes long, like not really a whole lot happens. You could kind of just sum it up by saying like villagers, monster, eats iron, gets bigger, kills king. Like that's kind of what it is, because the characters, they're pretty much just like cardboard cutouts. None of them really have personalities. So you can't really like talk about, oh, this interesting relationship between these two develops in this way, because there's not really anything like that in the movie. It's kind of just them interacting with Pulgasari, having some nice set pieces and some like pretty good battle scenes between Pulgasari and the Imperial or Royal Army guys. There's not a whole lot to it.
No, it's not. I did kind of lose my train of thought on the last thing, and so I picked it back up, and I wanted to read this quote actually, basically,
go ahead.
What I was talking about how, we do kind of see it. A revolutionary is not just born in one moment. He says this quote, the working class should be set in the forefront, and that the process by which ordinary people acquire their world outlook and mature into revolutionaries should be shown in detail. It's all about showing how it builds and how people can be pushed to the breaking point, or pushed to the brink and the breaking point, and that this is sort of how a revolution begins, is not just having a monster come out fully formed, but having this, he's very much a representative of the people. He starts out as this cute little monster, and as their oppression is felt, so too does his strength and rage and hunger for justice that I was talking about. And so I just think that it is very interesting that as far as execution for what Kim Jong-il was going for in terms of these propaganda films, because it is ultimately propaganda in one way or another, he's at least succeeding. Yeah,
I do think that quote you pulled is actually really salient, and even though that book came out before this, it does a better job of like distilling what this movie is than either of us have tried to do so far.
Right. Yeah.
Because that's really all it is. It's showing what could be seen as a people's revolution in sort of allegorical terms, using this monster and the process by which that revolution comes to fruition.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, there are like probably a couple cool scenes we want to shout out. We do want to talk about the suit, because we do love monster suits and miniatures. I think Pulgasari is actually like a really cool design. He's like, it's elegant in its simplicity.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that he doesn't like actually really have any powers other than just being like a fucking hoss made out of iron that they can't do anything to. I think one of my favorite scenes is they try to set him on fire, but since he's made of iron, that just heats him up.
Yeah.
And then as the soldiers try to escape into a river, his like superheated body, he walks into the river and just fucking boils the army men alive.
Rough.
I thought that was so badass.
It's really intense. And I mean, you know, like that holds through. Like when one of our hero guys goes to touch him later, like he's still hot and he burns his hand a little bit. And you're like it has coherence all the way through. This is a really good monster movie. I love the design. Having this very cool, like, bull. It's not so much of the monster movies are very deliberately like a mutated creature or something.
Right.
And the idea of this being just a statue that comes to life, really lets them do some pretty interesting stuff with it.
Hey, kind of like another period piece kaiju film with a statue that comes to life.
Sure is, which you introduced me to, and I enjoyed that movie very much.
Yeah, it was a good one. But, you know, yeah, like he really does, like, even though this is like just some one-off North Korean monster movie propaganda piece, he really does have like a toyetic, striking classic design in a way that even some of the ones coming out of Toho really don't. Like, I mean, Gigan, like, what the fuck is he supposed to be?
All right, hey, let's not badmouth Gigan here.
But seriously, what is he supposed to be?
He's a death chicken.
With a circular saw in his
Hell
stomach.
yeah.
Yeah,
I don't know why you're acting like you don't get it. It sounds like you get it.
Okay. Megalon then. Or Destroya.
A bunch of tiny crabs join up to become one giant crab monster.
Yeah.
It all makes perfect sense, Chris.
I guess and actually now I had forgotten about this, but the guy that plays Pulgasari is the guy that plays Godzilla in
Holy
like the
shit.
first Showa era films. I completely forgot about that. So
That's important.
Obviously the acting for Pulgasari is on point.
Yeah. I love when the king is like, we're gonna exorcise the blacksmith right out of Pulgasari. That cracked me up that was how they're doing it, because they can't do anything to him. And so they resort to other means, and they're like, there's an exorcist in the village, go get her, and we'll take care of this blacksmith once and for all.
Which, again, kind of reminds me of the opening scene and some other scenes in Daimajin.
Yeah.
Kind of wonder if they took some inspiration from that. Because this doesn't, I mean, even though it has a giant monster in it, I mean, it's not really that similar to Godzilla.
Right.
Obviously, they would have been informed by Godzilla because he's the most popular giant monster. But in terms of storytelling and things like that, I don't know.
Much closer to Daimajin than Godzilla, for sure.
And yeah, I mean, there's a scene where the king makes a cannon, tries to kill Pulgasari.
Two cannons.
Multiple cannons. All that does is piss Pulgasari off. And I think isn't that during like the climactic battle?
Yeah, well, so he does die. The exorcism does work. And the blacksmith's daughter, like, again, very much sort of like, okay, what does this mean in terms of the allegory? There's this idea of like sacrificing yourself for the good of everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
Juche in particular is about self-reliance, right. And that's really what differentiates Korean communist thought from Marxist Stalinist communist thought, is this sort of idea of self-reliance, and that it's on the people to support the state, basically. And this idea, and obviously a lot of that involves having to sacrifice for the good of the many. And that's very much on display in this movie. You know, not only does the blacksmith's daughter like cut her arm open to try and bring back Pulgasari, which does work, and that's how he sort of gets revitalized for this final climactic battle.
Can't fucking stop him.
But also, I mean, we can get to this in a little bit, but there is another sacrifice that comes again, and it is very much sort of part and parcel of the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, you can go ahead and get into that if you want to, because I mean, other than that, there's really not a whole lot worth discussing. I mean, because it's kind of just the end of the movie is kind of just battles. Other than that, and really, if people want to see that, they should just go watch it because I mean, that's better than us explaining it to them. So go ahead and touch on that final sacrifice.
Yeah. So also after Pulgasari beats the army, the problem becomes now that he is this giant monster who is still hungry for iron. And that he's still taking all of their tools and their pots and pans and everything. And the people are happy to give it to him because he saved them. But the blacksmith's daughter basically realizes that this can't continue. And so she hides inside a bell, which is made of iron. And Pulgasari comes and eats her in the bell. And this sort of, because she's like the daughter of the blacksmith and also revitalized him and, you know, for one reason or another, consuming the blacksmith's daughter makes Pulgasari implode, for lack of a better word. He turns to stone and he crumbles. And there is the dead, crying blacksmith's daughter lying among the rubble. And she sacrificed herself again, this time for good.
Yeah. And I mean, that's Pulgasari for you.
You do get a little baby Pulgasari again.
Yeah.
At the very end.
They know what the audience wants and they brought him back.
Yeah. One thing that I did think was interesting was to kind of go hand in hand with your idea of there are kind of two sides to the story of the director possibly being kidnapped or whatever. That you can kind of interpret this in multiple ways that I think is pretty interesting.
This is one of the things I really wanted to get into with you, is just the multiple interpretations that you could bring to this movie, which is kind of surprising considering, you know, it's kind of just like this weird one-off monster movie from North Korea. But I remembered that after you watched this one for the first time, you made a comment about this being a veiled critique of Kim Jong-il.
Right.
And so why don't you tell us a little bit more about that specific interpretation?
Yeah. So I thought it was interesting that, I was one of the people who just kind of accepted the story at face value. And so with that sort of thought, I was like, the idea that Pulgasari, who is very much representative of the People's Revolution and ultimately sort of this like glorious leader and you know, that's all tied together. Ultimately, he is the thing that is still destroying them. Their hero has become the oppressor again. They're in the exact same spot that they were, except that now more people had died, and they were still losing their weapons and tools and pots and pans. And the idea that this wasn't going to be the thing to save you, I just think it was the kind of thing where maybe if you were looking for it, you could see that, but it's not necessarily the kind of thing that comes through if you're not specifically looking for it to be a critique. I just thought that it was really fascinating that the way that the ending gives it a little more depth than you might expect from just a straight up propaganda piece.
Yeah. And I know that since you watched it the first time and kind of came to that initial conclusion, you've obviously since done some deep diving into some of the background, read a lot of Kim Jong-il's writings on film theory. So I'm curious to know if your thoughts on that interpretation have changed at all.
You know, I think that what it ultimately comes down to for me is that he does kind of feel like someone caught between two worlds. And I think I am kind of inclined to believe that he did make this movie willingly, but I also think that he maybe wasn't quite as indoctrinated into Juche. And so I think that maybe he leaves people a little bit of an out. There is, again, in the art of the cinema, it is very much about how important it is to see the political themes and everything treated correctly and put on screen, because not everybody is in revolutions all the time.
Right.
And the way to develop class consciousness, if you're not currently being oppressed or in the middle of a battle, is by seeing it depicted in art.
Right.
And this sort, I mean, look, I don't think it's right for anyone to be completely indoctrinated into something. And so I think that the idea that this director did kind of come to it, maybe willingly, maybe not entirely willingly, you know, he was kind of put into a difficult position. I think that maybe it is about the revolution and he's happy to make it for Kim, but maybe he feels like there's a little something of his own message that he's trying to sneak in at the end as well.
Yeah, I think, that's definitely the most common interpretation of the film that I've seen, that it's sort of a veiled criticism of Kim Jong-il. And I think it's definitely one that can be argued without stretching too much. Like, the elements are there, but it's not one that I would really agree with for a few reasons. First, I think it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier and sort of plays off the trope of, those crazy North Koreans.
Right.
Because I think in order to believe that theory that Shin Sang-ok was critiquing Kim Jong-il under his nose, you kind of have to believe that Kim Jong-il was so insane that he would kidnap a film director from South Korea, give him millions of dollars to produce a giant monster movie, and then not oversee the film's production or have any input as to the contents of the film, and that he would then release that film to international audiences. And that just, like, it really just sounds far-fetched to me.
Especially someone who is as wrapped up in film as Kim Jong-il was. I mean, not only did he write this book about film theory, but, like, you know, in the book, he's constantly making reference to other movies and stuff. And he's like, this is a really good example of what I'm talking about. And so finally I looked it up, and of course it was fucking produced by Kim Jong-il. So it's like, it all begins to come together. But basically the point is that this was not the first film he was producing. It's not the first time that he had thought about movies and how they can talk and convey a message to people. And I agree that it does kind of require a pretty negative opinion of their intelligence.
Yeah, because, like, you could make the argument that he was just too dumb and didn't pick up on the subtext, except for that, as you said, he wrote a nearly 500-page book that is almost exclusively about subtext in filmmaking.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so another reason, like, that I don't really subscribe to that interpretation is that, you know, based on some of the things I was saying earlier, Shin had shown no qualms about producing propaganda films in the past.
Right.
Part of the argument for that interpretation of the film is that Pulgasari is sort of an act of rebellion or protest by Shin, but given his past, I'm not so sure that's the case, because he didn't do that under either of the other authoritarian regimes where he made films for them.
Yeah.
And another reason that I don't really, I'm sorry to shit on this theory that you put forward, but is that there is actually an English language remake of Pulgasari called Galgameth that came out in 1994 that Shin Sang-ok wrote the script for. And in Galgameth, the parts of the film that support this theory are completely absent.
Wow.
And that to me says that those aspects of Pulgasari are saying something other than just like Kim Jong-il bad, because if anything, you'd expect Shin to double down on the critique of the DPRK once he had full artistic freedom. But pretty much all of the political stuff is taken out of Galgameth, and it's kind of the guy that brings Galgameth to life is like a prince. So he's royalty also, fighting against some other royalty dickhead that took over his throne or whatever.
All right. Throw this theory in the trash. I'm done with it.
Yeah, like I said, I'm certainly not trying to dump on anyone that reads the film in this way. And I mean, if you fully subscribe to the death of the author, there's not really any reason that you couldn't read the film this way. Like I said, it's not a stretch at all to have that reading. But I guess, do you have any other alternative interpretations to put forward for Pulgasari?
I think that it's very interesting because there is kind of this adoration of Pulgasari that happens. And, you know, this was sort of when Kim Jong-il was starting to shift Juche started shifting from love of socialism to love of country and the leader. They call it our style of socialism. And it's not quite so dogmatic in the application of communism because, as they say, you need to take into account the different cultures. That Marxism is based on European experience, that Leninism is based on Russian experience, and that Juche is based on Korean experience. And, you know, I think on some level, that makes it very difficult for us to come to it and maybe necessarily understand it as much as someone who has been immersed in something like that for their entire life. I think that that ending is just really interesting to me, that she does ultimately have to sacrifice herself to stop Pulgasari. You know, there's a lot. I don't know. It's the kind of movie that you have to sit with, and that it is open to interpretation, that you can kind of chew on it a little bit. And I just think that's great.
Yeah. So I have sat with this one and I have chewed on it a little bit because I have been a fan of this movie for a while. So I've had much more time to kind of parse that out and sort of like
both times I watched this were this year.
Yeah. Like within the past probably like month and a half or something, right?
Something like that. Yeah.
So one interpretation, like we were talking about earlier, the transition to Juche away from Marxist-Leninism, it was a gradual process. And so in that transitional period, the North Korean government still espoused ideas that were Marxist-Leninist in character.
Right.
And like, I don't want to get too deep into Marxist-Leninist thought because I'm not the guy to do that. I'm far from being an expert on that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So just basically, I guess, for the listeners out there, consider a lot of what I'm about to say as the sort of explain like I'm 5 version of this. But it is possible that the monster Pulgasari is meant to be representative of Lenin's belief that capitalism is helpful for working people, at least at the beginning of the transition from feudalism to capitalism.
Right.
Because it enables them to escape what he called a feudal torpor. And he also believed that the contradictions that arise from capitalism would rouse working people to class consciousness, which would eventually create the material conditions necessary to move from capitalism to socialism. And again, this is like the elevator pitch version of all this, but it's clear that the people depicted in the film are peasants living in a feudal society. So you could say, I guess, that Pulgasari is capitalism. He rouses the peasants, allows them to escape their feudal torpor, as Lenin would put it, and ultimately becomes imperialist when it must invade other countries to sustain itself with their resources. The people realize this, they destroy Pulgasari, resulting in a new society that is neither feudal nor capitalist, where the workers are no longer oppressed. Your thoughts?
I love that. I really love that. I think it's great. I've recently read a really, really interesting review of the Michael Mann movie Thief, where there is sort of this, when Leo pitches to Frank, he says, you want to go to work for me directly. You'll pull down contact scores all over the country. You don't look, you don't case, you don't do nothing no more. We point you to a score. We tell you what's in there. When we tell you it's there, it's there. These are laid out scores. And he does the job. He's interested in it. And he is sort of suckered into this capitalist thing. He is the working man, Frank. And he gets suckered into this, but ultimately at the end, when Leo is like, he betrays him, he says, join a labor union. and Frank pulls out his weapon and he says, I'm wearing it. And
fucking great scene.
Yeah, it's a fucking great scene. And I think very much like Pulgasari, this sort of little guy using capitalism and using that to get the leg up, but then ultimately having to turn on it when it turns on him is just such an interesting narrative and an important communique, I think, as someone who is not exactly a fan of capitalism, in case you couldn't tell from everything I've been saying this entire podcast. That's a great theory. I think that it's a great interpretation. I like it a lot. that's probably what I'm going to consider it going forward.
Well, I have a few more, so not so fast. But I will say the one thing you do not want to do in terms of the movie Thief is rouse to class consciousness a guy that built like a 5-foot blowtorch. So, yeah, bad call on that one.
Yeah. Leo.
So one of my other things that I was thinking about with this movie is that maybe Pulgasari symbolizes the inevitable fate of a revolution without the guidance of a great leader. So one of the key ways, another key way in which Juche differs from Marxist-Leninism is the idea that popular masses are doomed to failure in their revolutionary movement without a great leader. So this is like the complete opposite of Marxist-Leninism. They are totally against the great man theory. They're all about the people.
Right.
But with Juche, they believe that you need a great leader to sort of lead the masses. And this is a theme that is seen time and time again in earlier North Korean films that also feature medieval rebellions that, although those rebellions are just and righteous in their intentions, they're ultimately doomed to fail because they had no great leader. The revolutionary spirit of the people will live on, as the baby Pulgasari does at the end of the film, but the people will never be able to truly overcome their oppressors without a great leader. So that's another thing I was thinking. What are your thoughts on that one?
I like that one too. I think that maybe you could be like, well, there are potential great leaders there. You know, it's a very much a male-dominated culture in Korea. And so, you know, maybe me being like, well, the blacksmith's daughter could have been the great leader. Like, they probably wouldn't have made that the case in there. But, I don't know. I could see it. I think that the capitalism one fits a little better for my taste. Maybe it's just because I am more intrigued by that being the idea, but yeah, I still think it holds a lot of water.
Yeah. So normally I would say, okay, like that's good and everything, but it requires too much knowledge of Juche and Marxist-Leninism. Normally that's what I would say. But then the only thing that makes me think that it's possibly the intended meaning is that, you know, his theories on filmmaking and how he definitely would want to imbue like specific things about Juche in filmmaking. But I agree, it's definitely a less well thought out interpretation, we'll say.
Yeah, I also think that the idea of that revolution is not so focused in Juche either, because of it kind of being kicked off on a little bit more of a materialistic level, because it comes from the like taking of their means of production, which is very much the Leninist Marxist approach. Juche, another way that it differs, is that it's very much about or rather, this will be easier to explain if I say that Marxist-Leninism considers that your thought is relative to your distance from the means of production. And Juche says that your distance from the means of production doesn't really have anything to do with it, that man is completely independent and can choose to just sort of make the correct choices eventually through this revolution and having the great leader and everything. And because it does sort of stem from this production level where that's really sort of the impetus, I think that this might just be a little early in the development of Juche for that to be the interpretation.
Yeah, I can agree with that, because I mean, I think it was only a few years prior where they said like, hey, we are not Marxist-Leninist, we are Juche. Right,
but and it's still still used a lot of the language of Marxist-Leninism as they made that transfer. So
yeah, I agree. I think final interpretation is that maybe Pulgasari is just meant to extol the virtues of self-reliance, which, as we've talked about, I mean, sometimes Juche is just translated as self-reliance, because it's one of the central concepts. Right. So as you were kind of touching on before, in Juche thought man is the master of his own destiny, and only by becoming self-reliant can a nation achieve true socialism. And through this lens, you could see Pulgasari as just sort of a stand-in for any number of things, whether it's dependence on others in sort of an abstract sense, or possibly symbolic of aid and assistance that North Korea was receiving from the Soviet Union or China that at first appears to be helpful, but ultimately becomes a hindrance when the people become dependent on it. How does that strike you?
Yeah, see, this is sort of where I start to struggle a little bit, because unfortunately, Juche does lend itself to abuses of power. It's very easy for the Democratic Republic of Korea to say things like, we don't have enough food to eat because you are not good enough citizens. And that self-reliance can really be used to put the onus back on the people in a way that I don't necessarily care for. And, I think that when you interpret it as sort of this, like, the vagary of dependence on others, I think that you could probably apply that to it. It's a little vague to really, because he is so explicit in his sort of examination of subtext, and the specificity of themes. I'm not sure that would be something he would go for. Right. But I do think that it's possible that that's what they're going for, certainly.
Yeah, possible. So it sounds like probably first one was the winner. And I agree. I feel like that one is the one that is best supported by
I do like
the
that
film.
Second one, too, though. I think that there is a lot to it.
Yeah. I think there's probably other things that I'm not seeing just because I have not read all of the writings of Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung.
And we're also on the other side of the world, we said, there's a certain level of remove where we're just never going to be able to pick up on every single piece of, like, cultural reference or whatever.
Yeah. It's a really interesting movie, as we've both said. It's I think when I first watched it, I kind of went into it with that attitude of, lol, North Korea, like, this is going to be so funny. And I kind of came out on the other side of, like, this is actually one of the better kaiju films that I've ever seen, at least in terms of what we were talking about before, like, doing what it set out to do.
Right.
The acting may not be that great, but I try not to harp on things like that too much, especially when it comes to a country that doesn't really have a history of filmmaking. It's not really fair to do that. And I think it's impressive that they were able to achieve what they did when they're basically on an island. Before Shin Sang-ok came, they wouldn't really have had anyone to turn to for advice on how to make films better.
Right.
And, whether or not he was kidnapped, that is the reason he was wanted there by Kim Jong-il, because he didn't have confidence in his own filmmakers to make a film that could be shown on the international stage and not be laughed at. And he was hoping that Shin would be able to do that for him. So yeah, it's just a really interesting film.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. I think that because I heard about this movie through people like yourself, and I kind of came to it with a little less trepidation, or a little bit of a higher bar, I guess. I was expecting this movie to be at least decent. And I was very happily met those expectations and more. I think that not only is it a fun monster movie, I think that it also has a lot going on in terms of the message, whether you agree with it or not. It has a lot going on in terms of interpretation, whether you agree with what we've said or not. This is a controversial opinion, even in front of you. I think that it is a much better and cuter baby monster than Minya. The monster designs are cool, and there's lots of tearing down buildings. I mean, what do you want, people?
Yeah, what do you want? And so, yeah, it's been a great discussion. I'm sure we could both go on for ages about this one, but I think at this point I'm all Pulgasari'd out.
Wait,
voice
we didn't have another hour extolling the virtues of Marxist-Leninism instead?
Well, if you want to, we definitely can.
No, that's all right. I'll save it for another time.
I still feel like I have a lot more to say on this one, but my voice is getting strained at this point, as I'm sure yours is as well. So I guess let's just bring it on home. And
Sure.
Would you recommend this film? Why would you recommend it? And who would you recommend it to?
Oh man, I would recommend this movie in a heartbeat. I think even just as a historical oddity, it merits watching. The fact that it has such an interesting backstory that, forces you to kind of reckon with your own biases as well. I mean, that's just fascinating. And then the fact that it is a good and entertaining movie on top of that, come on now. You can't really ask for much more. And, I would recommend this to anyone with a passing interest in the history of film, in politics, in Korean politics in particular, or Asian politics. I just think that there's so much going on with this movie that it's hard for me to picture someone who can't get something out of it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of that. I would recommend it probably mostly to the type of people that I've already recommended it to, which would be you and Dan from TYTD, people that aren't afraid of the silliness that's inherent in a kaiju movie. Because, it is a guy in a suit breaking miniature buildings.
That's what I'm there for.
Yeah, that is inherently kind of silly, but for the people that like it, that's kind of why they like it.
I always say that part of what I love about monster movies is that I feel like it's such a perfect intersection of the fantastical elements of film that really let you lose yourself in another world, but also with the seams of seeing how it was made. And like, there is truly nothing that brings me more joy than seeing the person inside of a monster suit. It's happened a couple times between the Gamera and the Godzilla series. There's I took a picture of the guy in the Rodan suit where like his face is just like salami sealed against the neck of Rodan. And it's just so funny, but like looking at it and being like, look at these miniatures, how much work went into it. The detail is just so incredible. And you really don't get that in other genres. I mean, monster movies just really have something special going on there.
You really don't. I guess you could say that
some sci-fi.
Yeah. I guess you could say that you can see how the Pulga sausage is made in this one. But I'll also say that the suit work and miniature work in this one is pretty much on par with anything out of Toho around the same time. I mean,
oh yeah, you don't get to see the seams that much in this one, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's really good. I mean, the miniatures are not as densely packed as they would be in like a Godzilla 84 because it takes place in feudal Korea, not Tokyo. But they are very good. There's a lot of fun scenes with Pulgasari interacting with miniatures where he breaks down the royal building. I think it's called the Greenhouse in North Korea, Blue House in South Korea. I could be wrong about that.
Also, just when he's like a little tiny Pulgasari and he's splashing water at them.
Or when he's an even tinier Pulgasari eating needles and locks and stuff like that.
Great work.
And there's a fun scene of him, crumpling up the cannons and eating them. I love that. It's just a fun movie. And not to put too fine a point on it, we'll just both say that you should probably go see it.
Yeah.
And guess that's it for this episode. I'm so Pulgasari to see you go. But we had to end this up sooner or later. And again, I want to say thank you to George for coming on and I guess sort of giving me the confidence and the means to do an episode like this, because I think with all those concerns I was having, it is much better to do it with a second person, because had George not been here, I'm giving off these interpretations and it kind of just seems like I'm stating this as fact. This is the way it is. But, he's allowed to be, he's there to be a little bit reticent and call me out when maybe if something I'm saying is incorrect or maybe too much of a stretch. So I was really glad to have you on this one.
Yeah, cut back to 10 minutes ago when I was like, yeah, that's the one. You're totally right.
So, yeah.
No, listen, truly my pleasure. You know, like you said, I really invited myself on this episode. So, thanks for having me, man. I love coming on the show and talking with you because you know so damn much. And, it's just a delight every single time.
Yeah. So thank you. I want to go ahead and give you the opportunity to plug anything you have in the works for your own podcast.
Yeah. I mean, hey, check out the best little horror house in Philly. We're everywhere that you listen to podcasts. Like Chris said, he's been on an episode talking about It's Alive. If you really enjoy the show, you can even find a bonus episode with Chris and I talking about the really cool, also experimental film Begotten on the Patreon. That episode rules.
Mm-hmm.
And we got all kinds of cool stuff coming up. Joe Wangert is going to be on the show. That's awesome. You just check it out, folks.
And
Little Horror PHL on Twitter.
Yeah. Go ahead and give all your credentials or places where people can find you.
That's pretty. I mean, Little Horror PHL, that goes everywhere, but also I'm mostly on Twitter. I don't do the other stuff that much. Even though I'm on it, you could follow. Maybe I'll be there. Twitter's really where you want to find me.
Gotcha. And if I'm correct, this episode might be releasing on the same day as one of George's podcasts where he will also be talking about Pulgasari independently. So you have that to look for.
I am?
Well, if this is coming out the same day as your mailbag ep,
oh yeah,
then it's possible that we're going to have a double Pulgasari Monday.
That's a beautiful Monday, baby.
Yeah, so we look forward to all of that. That's all I got. Got any parting words for our listeners?
Go watch Pulgasari. It's really cool.
Hey, co-signed.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. And again, be sure to check us out on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher. Drop by our website, channel83.video, and be sure to join our Discord server to join in on the fun. Follow us on Twitter at channel83pod, or send us an email at channel83podcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and as always,
long live the new flesh.